Liba Sanctum 227 of the All Vault was pitch black. It had to be, for any amount of light could permanently damage the precisely ordered scrolls, tomes and data slates that filled rank after rank of shelves. All were centuries old. The gentle humming and vibration of power armor could also upset the environment, which was tightly controlled to ensure the preservation of the priceless records contained within. As a result, Orator Sephax wore only a close-fitting tunic. Anything looser-fitting might brush against the Liba Sanctum's contents. The huge room was so dark only the powerful eyesight of a space marine could pick out any detail of the interior. Sephax was not alone. Tome Keepers serfs dedicated to the maintenance of chapter archives occasionally walked past him as he sat at a desk. They too were in body gloves, their movements incredibly light so as not to create more sound or disturbance of any other kind than was absolutely necessary. These servants of the chapter were ritually blinded upon full induction into their role, which they held for life, in order to ensure they never felt a desire for light and could maximize the use of their other senses. Sephax sat at a large wooden desk. A selection of volumes and codices were arrayed before him on a series of silken sheets to protect their covers, and he wore a pair of gloves made from the same material. The Orator was a space marine. He could crush a human skull with his bare hands and punch through solid walls. He wielded weapons that ordinary, unaugmented men would barely be able to lift above their heads, let alone fight with. But Sephax's genetically enhanced physiology was a creation straight from the mind of the Emperor himself. He could turn ancient vellum and parchment pages with a level of care and dexterity no more achievable for basiline humans than lifting his Crozius Arcanum. There were probably, Sephax reflected, few newborns in the Imperium being handled as delicately as the documents he was reading. It had been a month since Sephax and the Tome Keepers under Captain Nassium had returned from their victory over the Alpha Legion on the world of Anakletos. The Orator had been changed by that campaign. He had, for the first time, come to truly appreciate the ways and traditions of his chapter. Created a grey shield, and not born of Istruma, he had always fulfilled his duties honourably, but he had never personally connected with them. But when he'd read the near-empty tomes of slain warriors, who he knew were valiant, loyal, and great servants of the Emperor, he had come to realize why the Tome Keepers recorded their deeds in so much detail and revered their history. It was about more than remembering the fallen and preserving lessons. It was their legacy, a means to ensure a battle brother's deeds outlived them for the benefit of all. It was a way of remembering brotherhood, a way of enshrining all who wore the heraldry of the chapter within the chapter itself. It was a way to recognize the deeds of the individuals that made the brotherhood what it was. Most importantly, Sephax had come to realize there was no such thing as a space marine. There were only Tome Keepers, Doom Eagles, Ultramarines, Crimson Fists. Without a chapter, a space marine was nothing. When he returned to Istruma, Sephax saw the world in a new light. He saw not a planet that he could consider his primary base of operations, but a home. He saw the dunes and the mountains and the rivers not merely as terrain to be mapped and tactically assessed, but as wondrous things to behold and admire for their own sakes. Sephax had taken a Thunderhawk to observe his home world at the first opportunity. He had wanted to see it all with fresh eyes. He had marveled at the gem-like islands of the Madisabu archipelago, the deep, shadowed grooves of the Red Canyon, and the majestic crater lakes that glistened in the light of Istruma's sun. Sephax had also relished gazing over his world's cities. Each was a marvel of Istruman ingenuity and learning, surviving despite the terrible radiation that poisoned the surface. Arazi, the oasis city, deep within the windswept Kasama Desert, close by Sharukar, known as the temple for the pre-imperial once holy site that had long since been converted to the worship of the emperor, which was ever surrounded by an enormous tent city, brimming with pilgrims. Erigash, the city of 9 bridges, sprawled over the mighty river Durrani. Leagues along the river's meandering onslaught there was Larsilim, the moor. Out of this gaping hole in the side of a mountain, the river water poured into a huge lake. Somehow Istrumans had founded a thriving settlement in the moor itself. Where Sephax could not have missed Malibat, known as the quartet for the 4 great spires of learning that towered over the rest of its architecture, he found it all but impossible to find Maradab. Known as the Masked Much of it lay underground, where its populace quarried for quartz and mined for precious stones. Each was a symbol of Istruman tenacity. Few people lived beyond 30 here. Every settlement had taken generations to build, and many people died before what they were constructing was finished. Yet they worked anyway. The legacy of the Tome Keepers had taken millennia to build, its originators long dead before the chapter took its current shape. Sephax saw a powerful parallel. The Space Marines might be longer lived than the population, but they shared their traits and their desire to build something greater than themselves, no matter the adversity before them. Sephax had next taken to exploring the great libraries of Istruma, and to the All Vault. He felt awe knowing how much of Istruma itself was locked into this place. The shelves were made from treated sequoia wood, the pillars from Istruman pyroxenite. He felt a deep appreciation for the ancient laws of the archive, which applied equally to everyone from chapter serfs to the chapter master himself. To place a volume in the wrong place was to have all ranks and privileges stripped. The number of records here was indescribable, though Sephax knew the precise figure was available to him to find out, if he so desired, for the Tome Keepers knew everything about what they possessed. Or so Sephax had thought. The orator had read many tomes in the short space of time since he'd returned to Istruma, absorbing all he could, deepening his love for his chapter with every word. He had started reading the tomes of the recently slain, a ritual habit many Tome Keepers partook in. But this led him down innumerable different routes as he sought out records of certain campaigns or details regarding battle brothers mentioned briefly by name in other tomes. He knew that he was becoming a better Tome Keeper and orator, with every second he committed to these studies. His feelings of fulfillment, however, had, over time, become feelings of deep unease. He had found something, a pattern in seemingly disconnected events, decades, sometimes more, apart. Eliphas campaign. Unexpected ambush by Kroot none apparently knew were even in the cistern, Sephax repeated in his head. Gladius-class frigate Harbakan. Ambushed by Eldari corsairs while en route to Istruma after successful completion of the Dalianan repression, a campaign in which casualties exceeded projections by more than 10%. Murder of battle brother Balashadra by traitor assassin on Pelesh 19. Sephax turned a page in the tome he was reading. It was an account of the final actions of Scout Sergeant Adadbal Enusat during the Xanathon campaign, dated to 588.M37, Istruman anchored time. Because none of Adad's squad survived the campaign, no living Tome Keeper knew precisely what had happened in his final moments. The details were collated through battlefield telemetry and surviving pit cam footage taken from his war gear after his corpse was discovered, and the subsequent autopsy. Adad watched the traitor's head burst in a puff of crimson through his magnoculars. "Sentry down! Move!" Adad advanced. He and his scouts were fanned across a plateau. Heavy snow covered the landscape and a thin fog had set in. He couldn't see any of his warriors, but he didn't need to. They had fought together for years now and had become a lethal unit. He trusted them. All would make for fine battle brothers of the chapter once they underwent the implantation of the black carapace. The sergeant did not expect a response to his command. He had ordered minimal contact. He knew his scouts would follow him. It was the squad's task to protect the right flank of the Tome Keepers' 5th Company below the plateau, as it advanced to a major traitor stronghold, one of few that remained on the northern continent. Adad felt a tremor. It was relatively light, well within the bounds of what was natural for this region. He continued pushing forwards. Ahead, Adad saw another sentry. The traitor was hunched over, rubbing her hands together to keep warm. With a single squeeze of his suppressed bolter's trigger, Adad ensured she never felt cold again. When he reached her mangled corpse, he covered it with snow. There was another tremor. This time, Adad nearly lost his footing. Then came another and another, until a low rumbling became an almighty thunder which filled Adad's ears and ended with a crash that sounded as if a dozen gunships had all ploughed into the side of the plateau simultaneously. Avalanche. He staggered as the ground shook and shuddered, and the rolling thunder slowly echoed away. The sound had come from ahead and to the left of Adad's squad's current course. Ears still ringing, he activated his vox to test the connection with the rest of the Tome Keepers' forces. There was no signal. Even the hiss of static was weak and patchy. Adad clicked his vox 3 times. Status. One by one, the rest of his squad responded. Adad exhaled a sigh of relief. "Advance," he ordered. Adad moved on in silence, weaving between snow-covered boulders, leafless shrubs and frozen pools. He kept an eye on his auspex as the fog thickened. Only half his squad were identified on it, the others out of range. Protocol insisted only that all remain within range of one brother. When Adad heard the first crack of autofire in the distance, he dashed into cover behind a pile of stones. In less than a second, that single shot had been replaced by a deluge. 24 targets with small arms to the right flank, came the report from Scout Hassis. His voice was level. There was no need for vox silence when your position was so highly compromised. Adad rose to his feet. "All brothers to Hassis' position," he ordered. After they had covered a distance of 15 yards, Hassis appeared on Adad's auspex as a green blip. Soon after, a field of red lights showed the traitors who had attacked the scouts. Each of the sergeant's heavy steps crunched snow and ice, each breath sending a cloud of steam pouring from his mouth and nostrils. "Does anyone have vox contact with the 5th? Adad asked his squad. The series of vox clicks that followed told him the answer was very much negative. "Is this linked? The avalanche? The ambush?" asked Maruduk. "These traitors, they are almost broken. It must be opportunism," said Nizbelu. "Focus. Fight," Adad told them. By the time Adad reached Hassis's position, which was in a long ditch, most of the rest of the squad were there. Between them, they kept up a solid rate of fire, their pattern of reloading and taking cover, ensuring at least one bolter was always in full use. Auto and lasfire zipped overhead or struck the lip of the ditch in bursts of dirt. "There are more of them now, Sergeant," said Hassis. They were riddled with auto fire, took direct missile hits, or were shredded by mortar shrapnel. Blood trickled from wounds in Adad's arms and forehead, slowly staining the bleached bone of his armor a ruddy brown. Spent bolt cases lay all around him in pools of water, where their heat had melted snow. His bandoliers and ammunition pouches were empty. Breathing heavily, he drew his combat blade. Traitors were drawing close on all sides. "I am not finished yet, traitor filth. Wait until I am amongst you," he roared. Adad leapt to his feet, blade in one hand, pistol in the other as a bludgeon. The Tome Keepers sergeant charged. For the Emperor, for Ist. Ultimately, the war on Xanathon was won and the traitors crushed. The bodies of Adad and his scouts were eventually recovered. It was a small mercy. Had the bodies not been recovered, Sephax might not have had this information. He narrowed his eyes. The avalanche, the ambush. Were they connected? How could a force of traitors weeks away from suffering a crushing defeat manage such an operation? How could starving, desperate heretics successfully ambush and pin down a squad of Space Marine scouts? Something else was at play. The orator knew it. The thought was almost too horrible to contemplate. But it was a Tome Keeper's duty to follow the evidence to wherever it led, even if it is into oblivion. He was not there yet, however. The evidence might circle the abyss, appear to fall down that path, yet detour at the last second to somewhere else. "I need more." He turned to another volume. An account of Sternguard veteran Awian Balraman, survivor of an attempted infiltration of an Orc encampment during the Herethel retaliation, an event which took place in some far-flung war zone in the early days of the Indomitus Crusade. Awian leapt over the corpse of the Orc he had just slain, smoke still pouring from the bolt craters in its green leathery skin. The remaining battle brothers of his squad were running, and not towards the enemy. Awian's stomach contorted at the thought, as his teeth rattled with the detonation of every Orc cannon-hurled shell. The Orcs were entirely indifferent to the destruction they caused to their own encampment. Crude shelters, munition stores, and workshops all around the fleeing Tome Keepers were being destroyed by the Orcs' relentless fire. As the buildings were blown apart, shards of searing hot steel scratched and scored Awian's plate. The attack had failed. Awian ducked beneath Orc tracer fire, jumped over burning tires, and dashed around corners in the maze that was the Orc camp. Everything had been planned to perfection. Yet now here he was, running for his life, his only consolation, killing the few Orcs who stumbled into the Tome Keeper's path. The Orcs should not have been present in the camp, at least not in the strength they were. The pilgrim armies of the War Cardinal were supposed to have drawn them all out to battle. Yards ahead and off to Awian's left, A huge orc emerged from a shelter that had miraculously avoided destruction. Brother Caruzir ran straight into it, knife drawn. Tome Keeper and orc hit the floor, and Caruzir came back up bloodied, but slowed enough for more orcs to emerge and bring him back down, vicious weapons cutting into the joins of his armor and helmet. His ident rune flashed red. Awian roared and triggered the melter gun of his combi bolt rifle. A long hiss of superheated air engulfed Xenos and fallen space marine alike. There was no way to recover Caruzir's gene seed here, and Awian would not see it fall into the hands of the orcs. It was the same with Caruzir's tome. The dead Tome Keeper's Hasasi, a serf who had committed the contents of his tome to memory, would have to ensure the account of the space marine's life and deeds was not lost. "Run, brother!" shouted Nabaka. He and Indus were Awian's only remaining squadmates. Awian ran. His lungs burned with the effort. His twin hearts beat so quickly they felt as if they might burst at any moment. It was not supposed to be this way. The early part of the Tome Keepers' attack had been smooth. The pilgrims were to distract, the Tome Keepers were to infiltrate and wreak havoc, sororitas and regiments of Carolingian devoutes were to carry out the final extermination. They knew communications would fail inside the Orc Camp, because of some strange Orc mechanics edifices, the Tome Keepers' targets, so they had no way of finding out how and why the pilgrim armies had apparently failed so entirely. Awian barreled through the next orc in his path, smashing his combi bolt rifle into the alien's face and slashing his combat blade through its guts. He then pivoted on the spot, running backwards. He took aim at the orcs pursuing them, whose roars filled his ears. They were so close he could see the spittle of battle lust drop from their mouths onto the dusty ground. He squeezed his weapon's trigger 3 times, altering his aim with each shot. 3 orcs slumped in quick succession, tripping up their fellows running behind them. Awian turned back around, only to see a looted Leman Russ bearing down upon his squad on the right, emerging from behind an enormous mound of scrap. Sheets of twisted metal had been bolted onto it and painted red. Crude orc sigils adorned every part of its surface. The tank's cannon erupted in a cloud of smoke, the recoil driving the front of the vehicle off the ground. In almost the same instant, Brother Indus, who was no more than 20 yards in front of Awian, disappeared in the explosion. "We will come back here. Xenos!" Awian shouted between heavy, desperate breaths. "We will end you before this war is done." Awian's vox crackled. Their communications were coming back to life. They would soon be able to call for reinforcements and make good their escape. "Only 200 yards, shouted Brother Nabaka, who came up on Awian's left so they were side by side. Awian's vox crackled again. He heard voices this time. "This is Brother Nabaka. Our infiltration of the Greenskins' encampment failed. Only I and Brother Awian remain." Awian looked to his left. Nabaka was down. His armor's power pack billowed smoke. Blue sparks crackled and spat where cables had been shredded. Awian emptied his combi bolt rifle's magazine into the pursuing orcs, grabbed Nabaka and ran towards the edge of the camp. At long last he saw the telltale trails of whirlwind missiles streaking overhead towards the pursuing Xenos, and heard the roaring engines of Storm Raven gunships in the distance and the whirring of spinning assault cannons. Thank the Primarch. Sephax closed the tome and closed his eyes. Awian and Nabaka had survived their ordeal, but only just. However, many Tome Keepers had been killed, and the orcs were not defeated for many more months after they could have been. The orator was one step closer to believing his suspicion true, one step closer to the abyss. Here was another failure of ecclesiastical forces allied to the Tome Keepers, in unusual circumstances. Were they linked? Sephax did not want them to be. I will read one more. The Tome of 2nd Company Assault Marine Nahruna Bal Aram, the Gathanod Uprising, 708.m40, Istruman Anchored Time. When Assault Brother Naruna landed from his jump, he crushed a beastman to paste in a hideous cacophony of flesh squelches and bone snapping. Gore splattered his armor and drenched the other beastmen around him, who flinched and recoiled from the Space Marine's sheer impact. The Tome Keepers of Naruna's squad laid into them, hacking at them with chainswords and firing bolt pistols into their packed herds at point-blank range. The mutants went down in droves, snarling and braying as their skulls were carved in two, their limbs torn off and their torsos blown out, No Space Marine pushed further into the Beastman than Naruna. He and his chainsword and bolt pistol roared together in a harmony of killing. It was little different for the other assault marines, and as a squad they composed a symphony of slaughter. The Tome Keepers were not a chapter, noted for their bloodlust or impulsivity, but their hatred for the traitor, the heretic and mutant, was no weaker than that of the Flesh-Tearers, or Black Templars. And so they butchered. They butchered even as their muscles burned with fatigue. They butchered even as the teeth of their chain blades clogged with meat, matted fur and torn ligaments. They butchered even as more and more of their frothing, braying enemies threw themselves into combat. They butchered on, knowing their actions were not mindless, for they did not fight alone. For the Emperor! Death to the mutant! Purge the unclean! So were the battle cries of the battle sisters of the Order of the Midnight Rose. Their fury was that of the zealous fanatic, and with flame and bolt and blade they piled into the Beastmen. The Tome Keepers of Naruna's squad were the tip of the spear. The Sisters of Battle drove it home with the killing thrust. In less than a minute the Beastmen broke, and the Sisters pursued. For several hours this was how the battle was conducted. The Tome Keepers used their mass and power to drive deep into the enemy ranks, weakening them, allowing the Sisters of Battle to crush them in a follow-up charge. It proved devastatingly effective. With every surge, the Imperial forces gained more ground, and enemy resistance crumbled. "The Beastmen are all but broken," said Brother Tarulsh. "We are pushing them well. We must not relent," said Naruna. The Sisters had been joined by a penitent engine in their most recent charge. Beastman blood caked its morning stars, whirring saw blades and piston-driven feet. Were Naruna of a weaker constitution, the reek of holy unguents, gore, engine fuels, and the burning of the human tallow candles affixed to it would have made him nauseous. It clanked and stomped to keep pace with the battle sisters. Piloting the battle walker was a man. He was chained to the device, the top of his head ensconced in a dome-like helmet. He clenched his teeth, which were pink and bloody. Naruna spat. Such beings were all but failures. Their punishment, or opportunity for redemption, was to be implanted into penitent engines and hurled at the enemy to cause as much devastation as possible. Their effectiveness was not in doubt, as Naruna saw as this one carved through beastman after beastman and torched dozens more with searing flamer bursts. But they were a symbol not only of the weakness that lay in the hearts of so many people, but also the depravity of humanity. For what other species could have conceived of such an ugly and foul machine? "Tome Keepers, charge!" ordered Qasim, Naruna's sergeant. They could end this swiftly by committing to a final effort, and this place would be purged. The time for caution and tactics was past. Naruna charged. Even as he slaughtered his way through the beastmen, Naruna could see the fountains of gore being created by the penitent engine as it rampaged. There was no control or skill in its movement. Its killing was frenzied, no less brutal than that of the mutants it slaughtered. Naruna could not help but watch its mindless butchery. It crushed beastmen and ripped them apart. For a moment, Naruna was reminded of the immense power of his chapter's own dreadnoughts. This engine lacked all the nobility and honor of such venerable machines, however. They were nothing alike. Naruna was 100 yards from it when he saw it stop. It shuddered and spasmed. The pilot screamed. So loudly, Naruna could hear it over the din of battle. What in the name of the Primarch? The scream changed, a combination of human screeching blended with hissing static and electronic whines. And then the engine returned to movement. With incredible speed, it surged forwards, gouts of flame blinding Brother Lawuza to its approach, before bringing its buzz, saws to bear. There was a brief blast of sparks as metal hit ceramite, then blood. Lawuza was torn apart. "End it now," ordered Sergeant Qasim. Naruna ran. By the time he reached the engine, Qasim's bisected corpse had been set alight by the machine with a burst of flame. Closer, Naruna could tell that the crackles and screeches the engine was making were not random. They were words. He had little idea what it meant and didn't care. He dived towards the engine, chainsword whirring. He ducked beneath a whining saw blade and slashed his weapon across the back of a knee joint. But his chainsword, blunted on the flesh of beastmen, couldn't find purchase. Sanctum, the berserk machine screeched as it engulfed Brother Absalon in flames. "Sanctimonia!" It struck Brother Marutar's skull and torso, caving in both. Naruna barely had time to escape the flails himself, as his blade was entangled in their chains and yanked from his grip. When he brought his bolt pistol to bear upon the pilot, a click told him the weapon's magazine was empty. He quickly ducked another ferocious blow and leapt over another into a forward roll. He barely regained his footing amongst the corpses of beastmen, battle sisters, and space marines. The assault marine drew a crack grenade from his belt. He noticed that for all the apparent madness of the penitent engine, not one battle sister had fallen to its weapons. It had not targeted them. Though some of the Adepta Sororitas were racing to engage the crazed walker, its turn had been so sudden they had not had time to intervene. There was no time for Naruna to wait for them. The engine had to die. Naruna needed to get within the walker's reach. Its size would be its disadvantage. The assault marine approached the engine over and over again before withdrawing. He retreated further each time, drawing the walker away from the battle so that he would have more space. The air seemed filled with whirling flails, plumes of burning promethium, and spinning saw blades, but Naruna avoided them all. When you think yourself unarmed, remember your mind. It is the deadliest weapon you could ever possess. So went the wisdom of Kazib al-Samu, a legendary Tome Keeper said to be the greatest unarmed combat tactician and fighter in the chapter's history. There was no taunting this enemy, Naruna realized. Though it was focused on him, its rage was total. It was throwing all of itself into the attempted kill, heedless of everything around it. Everything was down to timing. Naruna unclasped his jump pack and let it drop to the ground. It was too bulky. The assault marine stood still, just for long enough to encourage an all-out charge from the penitent engine. It raced towards him, indifferent to the jump pack lying in its path. As it stepped over the abandoned piece of equipment, a part of its foot caught it. Not much, but just enough to cause it to stumble for a second. It was Naruna's chance. He raced towards the walker and primed his crack grenade. He leapt and maglocked it to the engine's core. He pushed himself off the walker's metal frame with a kick, but as he did so it jolted in an attempt to reach him with its buzz saws. The engine swung at him again, sawing off a leg below the knee. Naruna crumpled to the ground, blood pumping out of his stump, as the crack grenade detonated. Sanctimonia. That was what the being at the core of the penitent engine had screamed. Sephax rose and walked carefully along the rows of shelves in search of a volume. He strode with all the bearing a place of such dignity required, but his heart pounded. Where are you? Primarch, please, be here. He almost emitted an audible sigh of relief when he found it. An ancient codex, one he had read before he and Nashim's strike force had travelled to the Nephilim sector. Sephax returned to his desk, gently moved aside the other tomes he had been reading, placed this new volume down and opened it. On the title page, there it was, the name that might explain everything, Sanctimonia. The Sanctimonia conflict had occurred in 291.M37, and though it began upon the ecclesiarchal world of Sanctimonia, it had engulfed an entire system. It was a war which frayed the Tome Keepers' relationship with the Order of the Argent Shroud of the Adepta Sororitas, the Black Templars, and elements of the Ecclesiarchy. The principal event that had driven this took place on the shrine world of Bespax. There, Saduk, the captain commanding the Tome Keepers' forces, authorized the destruction of the Mausoleum Divinito, a huge crypt containing the bodies of over 300 Imperial martyrs. The Tome Keepers had been left with no choice but to do so, for within, a host of cultists had opened a warp portal. Saduk's response to Ministerum complainants was legendary within the chapter. When enraged priests and deacons protested about the destruction of such a holy site, and the relics within, the captain had merely said that given. The martyrs had been martyred once already. A second death would cause them no additional harm. The Tome Keepers had also earned the ire of the Cardinal Palatine of Sanctimonia, Simonius Fulca. The priest had disregarded the Tome Keepers' careful plan for the capture of a heretic-held city on the world of happenstance, intending to lead a glorious charge by his own troops and claim the glory for himself. His all-out assault failed entirely, and the Tome Keepers were forced to intervene to save the survivors, including the Cardinal Palatine. This act won them no favour with him, however. They decried his indifference to human life. He in turn accused them of failing in their duties to Emperor and Imperium. Falk had sworn the Tome Keepers would be punished one way or another, in his lifetime or later. It would seem the Cardinal Palatine was not wrong. Has your hate for us been the cause of so much pain and death for our brotherhood? Sephax wished it was not so, but it was a viable explanation. So many of the events of loss he had read of were associated with ecclesiastical forces. According to the orator's research, the Cardinal Palatine had been extremely powerful and influential. His reach was known to be enormous, with political allies across multiple sectors he had carefully cultivated over centuries of rejuvenate extended life. He was also known for his extraordinary capacity for scheming and grudge-holding. There might well be a cult or conspiracy working within the ecclesiarchy, intent on undermining the Tome Keepers and operating according to the will of Fork since the Sanctimonia campaign. I am past the point of no return. I have crossed the threshold of oblivion. The Tome Keepers are being targeted by forces who should be allies in the Emperor's service. Shadowy figures hiding themselves within the ecclesiarchy. What are their true intentions? Do they seek not merely to harm us, but also to cause rifts between us and other forces loyal to humanity? Sephax knew more research would only further confirm his suspicions, and would be a waste of time when action was needed. The orator closed each open tome on his desk. He then took each one to its place on the shelves, where necessary, reactivating the stasis field which preserved it. Though his body shook with pent-up adrenaline, he carried out no act in haste. Sephax stopped at the threshold of the Liba Sanctum, looking back. All that death dealt because of pride, wounded pride. He turned and walked on to find Captain Nazium. There was a rot that needed burning out. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing and leaving a comment below.